Yeah, thanks, Phil. Yeah, when you first mentioned to me reviewing some of the budget points, I had my initial reaction in my head is always anytime someone brings up the budget, exactly what you said. Like I'm not an accountant, right? Like numbers and all this can be very scary sometimes. And I'm very appreciative of the support that we continually have in kind of creating these budgets and making sure that we're dotting all our I's and crossing our T's, so to speak. So within the budget, we're going to detail all the costs of the project, and you want to be as comprehensive as possible here. I think that a common mistake that I've made in doing budgets is just forgetting some of the smaller costs that come through. And especially if you're going to have any subs, if there's going to be, we run it through Kentucky, make sure you're using the correct F&A, right? Like all of those things. As you're developing a budget, sometimes you see, oh, I have $1 million to spend, and your eyes get really big. Then you realize you don't have $1 million to spend, right? You have, right? When you break it down year by year and you look at the actual costs, even like personnel costs, sometimes you got to get into the nitty gritty details and understand that it's not just salary, we're paying salary and benefits. So there's all the little details, and sometimes the dollar amounts don't go as far as you initially think they will. And so that's important to remember as you're doing this, is you want to make sure that you detail every single little cost down to a T. And they're going to ask you those questions. We're going to talk about that later. And I guess I'm jumping ahead down to the budget justification, but you're going to have to justify every cost too, right? So if I'm writing something in, so for example, oftentimes for evaluation, when we put contracts, we have to use our evaluation grant dollars to pay for our software licenses. And so every time I'm doing something, I'm trying to include the software licenses we use for things like Smartsheet or Tableau or NAC or whatever data system we're using for this project. And so I'm going to have to very specifically say, this is the software program I'm going to use, and this is how much the annual license costs, and this is how much I plan on using from this every year to pay for this. Travel expenses, like they're going to want you to get very specific. Is this in-state travel? Is this out-of-state travel? How are you going to handle that? Obviously, our office has been extremely helpful with in helping us make sure that we have all the rates correct. But those little details are things that can sometimes take a lot of time. So you want to be prepared to kind of flesh all of those things out. The funding announcement is typically going to include an average size and a maximum size of award. It's important to never go over the maximum. Okay, that's one thing. Also, be aware of nuanced funding opportunities that might have a ramp up. Like, for example, Dr. Rummel and I are working on a proposal right now where year one, the funding is reduced pretty significantly in year one and increased in year 2, 3, 4, and 5. Right. And that's because in year one, they're expecting us to do a lot of ramp up to prepare for the intervention that we plan on using. And so the funding increases year over. So it's not always just here's a flat thing and we're going to divide it equally over every year if it's a multi-year project. Right. So that's something that could be you have to look out for and think about. It might have different required budgetary elements. So they might require you to add specific line items in that budget, such as travel. They might have restrictions on subcontracts, for example. Being someone who's working in evaluation, sometimes they have a max on evaluation. So, for example, when we're doing an evaluation for a contract, we typically aim for anywhere from 10 to 12% of the overall budget for the evaluation. However, for example, a proposal that we're working on right now, there's a maximum of 5% for an internal evaluator because they've already hired on an external evaluator for the project. And so it's great because that's going to be much less burdensome in terms of what needs to be done evaluation-wise. We also have to be aware that any evaluation components we build in, we're capped at 5% for that. Okay, so that's something to be aware of. Thinking about direct versus indirect costs, again, I mentioned that earlier. Knowing the indirect rates and what's going to come out off the top is going to be really important, and making sure that you're balancing and being aware of those, preparing for those. Any cost sharing. So I can, and Dr. Rummel, you can speak to this because I know you and I have been on several calls where proposals have almost completely fallen apart because we haven't been able to find a really relevant cost sharing opportunity. So that is, some grants are going to require you to kind of put forth some of the cost of the project yourself in some way, shape, or form. And that's what cost sharing or even matching in some aspects can be. So I can think of one project. It was a larger proposal we were working on. We had it all hashed out and developed. We thought we had a cost sharing opportunity lined up, and it fell through, and the entire proposal almost collapsed, and we weren't going to be able to do the proposal because we didn't have the cost sharing that we needed. Luckily, in the 11th hour, we were able to secure an agency that stepped up and was willing to do the cost sharing because they believed in the proposal, and they saw how it would benefit their agency and their program pretty significantly. And so we got lucky in that one. But it's important to be aware of and have a really secure plan A. And I would argue maybe even have a plan B if the plan A is not set in stone concrete as far as cost sharing.
And you want to be really careful about the requirements of the cost share, or what they call in contribution. Sometimes they call it match, but each thing is a little different. Some grant applications will allow you, let's say we're working on a project and they say you have to cost share 5% of the budget. They might allow UK, for example, to release, to make an adjustment in a person's load or their employee appointment to account for them working on the grant. So they're not actually giving money to the grant. They're just assigning a financial value to the time that someone would devote to it that's not charged to the grant, but is absorbed by some other way. Other times, as in the case of what they call a match, you literally have to put the money up. You have to write a check. So you might have to write a check for $100,000, your organization, in order to leverage the $1 million that the grant budget allows. And sometimes it's more difficult to arrange those matches because there are restrictions on how that money can be used, whether you can recapture it back through the project or not. So when you see cost share, in-kind contributions, or match, you got to look at the particular requirements of the proposal. So, Michael, I'm glad you mentioned that in particular. And this is really a nuanced thing, but it goes back to, when in doubt, go to the fundamentalist interpretation of the grant proposal. Whatever's in there is what you follow. You don't improvise.
Yeah, read the fine print. Is it, and have somebody on your team that is really good at reading fine print, because I know sometimes, I've missed things, and we've had great team members that are very detail oriented that have picked up on stuff that I've missed or that we've missed. So that's why it's important for multiple eyes to be looking at the opportunity, right? The funding opportunity.
Okay.
I mentioned earlier, the budget is not an estimate, it's the actual cost. So they're going to ask you to be very specific, and you're going to have to give very detailed numbers on everything that you're going to be doing, how much it's going to cost. And again, that's going to turn into that budget justification, which is a very important document. I think that there's a little bit of an art there. Again, we're going back to the art of the proposal, and saying why we need person X, Y, or Z, or why we need service. It's not just, hey, I'm going to do this, this, and this. It's, I'm going to do this, and here's why it's absolutely necessary that we do this, right? And here's what this is, what this entity, this personnel, this program, this service, this travel. It's not just we're going to travel. It's, this is why we're going to travel. This is what we're going to use the travel funds for. It's not just that I need software money. It's these are the specific programs that we're going to buy, that we're going to utilize, and here's how we're going to utilize them. It's not just, I need Dr. Gooden and Dr. Rumrill to help me on this grant. It's, here is the role, and here are their specific responsibilities, and here's what they're going to bring to the table, and here's why it's necessary for me to pull these people in and to pay for them. I mean, ultimately, you're looking at this from a lens of stewardship, right? This is an entity that's providing you the funds to carry out a project, and their expectation is that you are extremely well prepared and that you're going to be a good and faithful steward of those funds that you're receiving. And so the budget is just providing the foundation for what will then be a hopefully faithful stewardship process of the grant monies as they come through. And I would say finalize the budget early on, get all your needed approvals. That is something, again, if you wait till the 11th hour to try to do some of this, you're setting yourself up for missing a proposal deadline, for having a lot of red tape, for having your sponsored program office be very, very upset with you, asking them to work late into the evenings the week that the proposal is due if you wait too long, right? So there's a lot of traps that you can set yourself up for if you wait too long on getting the budget, finalizing the budget, making sure that this is what it needs to be. I would I don't know if you're the sort of person that when you plan a vacation, you look at all the things that you want to do and you try to fit it all into your 3 or 4 or 5 day trip, because I'm kind of that way. And that part of my personality sometimes carries over when I see a grant budget and I'm like, oh, look at all the things that we can do. We can do this, we can do this, we can do this. And then when you actually sit down and start putting dollar signs next to each activity, next to each thing, sometimes you realize that sometimes your eyes are a little bit bigger than your budget. And you need to figure out what's the absolute necessary functional things that we need to be doing on this project, and what are some things that we can do if we end up having the budget to be able to do it. So that's important. One other flip side, maybe warning or thought I would have, is that sometimes I see people go into this and they think if they can make the cheapest proposal possible, they're going to have the best chance of getting the grant. Right? If they try to cut costs here and cut costs there, then they're gonna show that they can do more with less. And I would say, please save yourself the trouble and do not ever do that. I think that I've jumped on a couple projects over the years where they tried to do more with less, and it is an absolute nightmare. So I think one thing I would say is make sure that you're valuing what you're doing accurately, right? So for an evaluation, I know for a fact that we can't do the work for 3% of the budget. We need a large chunk of the budget to be able to actually do the work that's being required of us. And if I try to do $100,000 worth of evaluation work for 50 grand, that's not fair to my team. That's not fair to anybody. Right. And that's setting ourselves up for failure. So I think you need to make sure that and it's hard to do because you're putting a dollar sign on something that, hours that can be really difficult to sit there and really figure out exactly how many hours something is going to take. But knowing your team and having experience in doing these projects ahead of time is going to help you hash that out and figure those things out.
Thank you, Dr. Leslie. Dr. Gooden, I'm thinking about our lovely LEND project, and it certainly is. It does have, I think it's fair to say, a pretty complicated budget where we had to learn some things on the fly. And as we've administered it, I wonder if there's any lessons you've learned from that or other projects you'd like to share with the group.
Yeah, I was just thinking 2 things, Dr. Irma. One is read the budget specs carefully. As Dr. Leslie was saying, if you miss something until the last week, you have to go back and fix it. So read very carefully what they require. Luckily at UK, our funding folks have us turn in our budget, our proposed budget and justification early, which is really good. They look at it early and they can advise us if we're forgetting something, which helps because that budget really does drive what you do. And the other thing I would add is that if you're doing any kind of a training project like the LEND, oftentimes student support is a huge proportion of your budget, can often be more than 50% of the money that you get. So if you're doing a training project, keep in mind that student support is usually a big chunk of your budget.
Appreciate that very much.
Dr.
Thank you both, Dr. Yes, sir.
We have a question from a participant, Dr. Rimmerl.
Excellent.
The question is from John, and the question is, when writing the budget, how do you articulate costs that are difficult to determine in the future, like travel or lodging, since those costs change throughout the years?
Yeah, that's a That's a great question, John, and particularly a lot of federal grants are 5 years and over 5 years. Let's look at our current rate of inflation. They say it's going down, but it's been pretty high the last few years, right? Last year, 8.7%. And so things really do change as far as that goes. I think you can, and it's the same is true with projecting salaries. And usually with salaries, you'll build in a reasonable salary increase for personnel, but that doesn't mean that it's going to be exact. Like you might put in a 2% raise and someone gets promoted in the middle of the project and they get a 10% raise. So it's not unreasonable to put in a small increment or adjustment for inflation as long as you stipulate that. In year one, for example, if you're putting in a cost and you figure the conference is $1,200 to attend, you want to go back to that same conference. I don't think it's unreasonable at all to note that you're putting in a 4% premium on top of that to account for inflation. But it is, Dr. Leslie said, it's not meant to be an estimate, but we really are, it is the exact amount you're going to get, but we are estimating those costs. And what you can do in the budget justification, you can say that travel costs are increased in years after year one, in subsequent years, in consideration of inflation or other activities that might be taking place. So you can put in an adjustment for inflation on things that have an expectable cost increase. John's question also brings to mind the fact, though, sometimes you put in the budget for one thing and things totally change. You put in a request for a technology in 1 year and 3 years later, that technology is totally obsolete and you need to purchase the other one. You can't control that. And so you can only project what's known, right now. And as quickly as things do change, you can always go back to the project officer when the grant's funded and ask for an adjustment in various aspects of the budget, provided that you're not exceeding the overall budget for that, for that particular year, and also that those costs are reasonable. Here again, I think this is where John's question, folks, really brings to mind the importance of that budget justification and being really clear. So if you put in an incremental increase for salaries and benefits, say why. If you do it for travel, you can also say why. If you do it for technology and equipment, say why as well. What's interesting about technology and equipment, sometimes that gets cheaper over time, but we rarely plan for the price to go down. We usually plan for the price to go up. But if you've got a reason to believe that those costs would be more, and you know that the history of registration in a conference goes up by a certain amount, I would say by all means put it in. And as long as you can justify it and you're very clear about that, that's usually not a major problem. Dr. Gooden, Dr. Leslie, anything on John's question? That's a great question.
Typically, the finance folks do a standard percentage of increase for salaries and for travel and things that the feds usually don't have any trouble with. It helps.
Yeah, and you want to stay within a reasonable, you don't want to project 14% salary increases for everyone, but 2 or 3% will usually be fine. It's a good question. Yeah.
And there's going to be years where the practical reality of the budget ends up being that you spend a little bit more in 1 year and a little bit less. It's always nice to have grants where you're able to carry over some of those funds and use the leftover travel funds from year one for some travel year two. That gets it a little bit into different details, but hopefully that's the case. And, maybe you underspend a little bit in 1 year and then you can, if you have to do a little bit more travel in the next year, you can make up for that. But yeah, definitely.
It's kind of like having a limit on your credit card, though. You can underspend. You don't have to spend all that's there. Although sometimes the granting agency will have requirements about that. They may or may not allow you to carry over, and you want to find that out. But you can never overspend. You can never spend more than is budgeted. And so it's kind of built in that it's really nearly impossible to go over. I would say in terms of carryover, think of it as a good thing if it happens, but you don't want to plan on it as you project your budget. You want to project the budget that will zero out at the end of each year. It never comes out exactly zero, to Dr. Leslie's point. Terrific. Next slide, please.
Okay.
Dr. Gooden, this is one of the first content sections of any proposal. It's called different things. Some call it the need section, the importance, the significance, sometimes the compliance with regulatory provisions, et cetera. But this is sort of chapter 1 of the proposal, no matter how you slice it. And in that regard, it's very important. What insights would you share with us about preparing that need section?
Well, one of the things I would refer back to what Dr. Rummel said earlier is when we've done need and significance sections, I always look at what the headings are in the RFP, like go with their headings verbatim. And they'll often, give us a clue as to what needs we need to address. Is it state need? Is it national need? So I always look at what you want to answer what they're asking. It's really important that you show that there is an innovative need in your area and that you have an innovative way to address it. So you have to document that, yes, there is in fact a problem here, and this is why we want to address this issue. You have to justify that it's important. I always like to use recent citations, if at all possible. I try to keep them within 20 years of recent research, except for seminal research, then it may be much older than 20 years if it's a seminal piece of research. But you want your information to be current, to document that this is a problem now. Here's what's been done so far. Here's the gaps. This is why there's a need, there's a gap that we're going to fill. So why is it important and why do we want to address it? What is our target population? That's important to specify. They want to know what ages are we targeting? What disciplines are we targeting? Are we targeting children, families, adults? And why do they need these supports? We also want to look at how long is our project going to be? Is it a 1-year funded? Is it a 5-year funded? That matters to how we propose what we're going to do. In this section, you also, again, this is basically giving them the outline for your whole project. So why is it important? Who are we targeting? And what are our goals? We want to spell out really clearly what the goals are of the project here. So here's this need related to substance disorder. Here's the goal that we've got to reach, for instance, people in underrepresented populations of the state. So be very clear what our aims are as they relate to that need. What are our goals? What are our objectives? Spell them out very clearly. Again, give current data on why this is an important need. And oftentimes the RFP itself will have specifications about what we need to include for this section. So again, read carefully for what they're looking for. They may have specific requirements that have to be addressed here, some of that regulatory compliance. Check out what they're looking for and make sure that you address what is required for this particular project. Dr. Rummel, Dr. Leslie, please add anything that you've got.
Thank you. I think I would
Dr.
say
Leslie?
that was excellent, Dr. Gooden. Thank you. The only thing I would say, just from a personal experience standpoint, is oftentimes I've gone in and I think, oh, I know what the problem is. I know what the statement of need is. And then I try to find a literature to support what I think, which is one way of doing it. It's important. But I think sometimes once I dig into the literature, I think, oh man, I really need a firmer grasp and understanding of what exactly is happening here. Like, it's something for a lot of us that work in the field, like, we see the need, but how do we say that in a way that's supported by the recent literature, like Dr. Gooden said, and how do we find that? And so I think it's really important to use your research skills. So this is one of the sections, if you're someone who has an advanced degree and you've taken research classes, or if you've written literature reviews or papers, like, some of those skills are really going to come in handy here. But you have to be careful not to turn this into a research paper too, right? You're still writing for the purpose of the grant. And Dr. Rummel, this is something that, from my personal experience, I know that you're excellent at. And so maybe you can speak to how writing a statement of need, you have to use it supporting research, but at the same time, it's not the same as, you know, some folks that are maybe used to writing research papers. There's some differentiation there.
Yeah, I think there's there's a sales pitch as you're describing the need, but a lot of times what will happen is, or I've run into this for sure, is I'll think there's a need based on my limited observation of whatever the phenomenon might be. And then as I dig into the literature, I find out that the need maybe is not as strong as I thought it was. Therefore, this project isn't as important as I thought. Sometimes the need's even stronger than I thought, and you want to then state that in the fairest and most accurate way you can. Sometimes you find that the need goes in a very different direction, that the target population doesn't really need as much help with educational programming as they do with employment after they finish. So you have to be prepared, I think, to be proven wrong by the data, and you have to first get all the facts in order, and then you begin the creative part, which is telling the story in the most compelling way. But you can never go outside of what the data are. And if the announcement says it's based on the need for, let's say, transition programming in the Commonwealth of Kentucky, and your whole literature review is on, or the evidence for your need is based on 2 studies that were done in Minnesota and Wisconsin, that's not really addressing it. So so make sure that the need you're articulating is specific, you know, to the target population. That's one. One is the whole confirmatory bias issue. You want to be prepared to be proven wrong, just like in a hypothesis in a research project. Let the data do the talking. And then after you've put in the truest measure of what the current status of the phenomenon is, then you go about making your point. Then you throw in the things like, we must do better. There's a glaring need, you know, for this, you know, and that is exactly the intention of this particular project. So you can put the hyperbole in there, but it has to be oriented to the data, and it shouldn't be any stronger than the data themselves suggest. So if something is a huge problem, don't be afraid to say it. If something's a slight or minor problem, don't overemphasize it. That'll really that'll come off as, you know, as disingenuous. So you got to be careful there. And as much as anything, is the need and significance related to the target population, the people you're wanting to work with. But we have to be careful not to confirm our own suspicions and interpret the data in that way. You got to start with what the findings tell us, right?
Something that just came to me, Dr. Rameau, as you were talking, is I was thinking about a project we wrote to provide support and employment services to transition age youth in the Commonwealth of Kentucky. And they ask in this section for very specific numbers. And so in some of these statements of needs, you're going to have to be very familiar with different data sources on the populations that you want to work with. This is just kind of a random example, but for this, we had to know how many individuals in our target areas with specific types of conditions or diagnoses that we were going to be able to serve. So it wasn't just, hey, there's a need. This is the specific number of people in this specific area that need these services, and here's how many we think we can reach with this program.
And often you have to reach out to your partners who you're soliciting right now. For instance, like we might have to reach out to KDE and say, please give us data on these students in this category. So oftentimes your partners are helping you get that very specific data.
We have a question related to this need discussion. And the question comes from Laura. Laura asks, how can we use a lack of published research to support your need? How can we use a lack of published research to support your need?
Yeah, that's a great point. And you'll see sometimes in proposals or journal articles, you know, it will say, you know, here we see that, you know, we know that there's this broader problem, let's say with labor force participation among working age adults with disabilities. However, our review of the existing literature indicates no studies that have tested the efficacy of an intervention to promote employment. Therefore, this project addresses this need, that need, et cetera. So what I would say is that you can use that as partial support for your need, but it can't be the only element of need. If the only reason for your study is we couldn't find anything to indicate whether this is an issue or not, then that's not really compelling. What is compelling is there's a strong need based on the evidence we do have, but that available evidence is not specific, or it is lacking, to Laura's point, right, in this specific area. And that can be very compelling in that way. But there will be, but in order to document the need, it's got to be done on the basis of more than just the lack of research in a particular area. So the lack of findings in an area doesn't mean there's a problem. It literally means we don't know what the issue, what the status of the issue is. So I really like the idea of using a lack of available evidence to support your particular strategy, but the broader need you've got to have that evidence for. So that's a great point, and it's a really a very nuanced question that kind of fits in with this issue of need. But if the reality is that nothing's been done in that area, and that's where you come in, I think that can be very compelling, along with some hard evidence that the need does exist.
And to that point, Phil, I feel like there's been projects where we've written these proposals where there's not necessarily published research on it, but we can get data and prove that there's a problem with some real hard data. So we can say that we know from general research across the country or across the international research that this is a problem, and we are showing it based on, like Caroline mentioned, maybe you can reach out to your partners, you can get some hard data to show, it might not be published data, but you can get some hard data, and as long as you have a source for that data and you can extrapolate that source within your citations, you can show that this can be an issue without necessarily having published research in that area, right?
Yeah, that's a great point.
Couple of the things I would add, Dr. Rummel, is that I often look at the proposal itself in their description of the needs section, and I see what literature they're citing, and I go to that literature and read it and see where all they're referring us to. That gives me a place to start in looking at the research that I'm going to use. I use what they use as seminal studies. Yeah. And something else that
No, that's great. Federal agencies particularly will do that, won't they?
Yeah, they get you started. And something else that we do, especially in an area that I really invested in for research, is I'll keep all my prior literature reviews. And each time I do a new proposal, I go back and look at my old literature reviews and update, so that I have a kind of a bank of citations now in different areas that can support different proposals.
Great idea. Thank you. Oh, great stuff. Great stuff. Let's go on to the next slide. And this has to do with the project design, which often includes a literature review in a little different context than what we've been talking about. I'll get us started on this one, and we'll love to have my colleagues weigh in on this one as well. So usually the first part of your project design, and here you're laying out all the operations of the project, whether it's a research project, training project, community service, whatever it might be. Here you're really specifying what you're going to do to address that need that you established in the first section. And here, when we call this a comprehensive literature review, it's no longer about the need or the target population. Here you're moving to a literature review that supports the intervention or the approach that you're taking in this project. And Dr. Gooden, when we worked together on the LEND proposal with a number of our colleagues, we were reviewing literature on best practices in leadership development related to autism and other neurodevelopmental disabilities. Whereas in the needs statement, it was about outcomes for children with neurodevelopmental disabilities. Now we're talking about support for our particular model. Or if we're doing a supported employment program for young people with substance use disorders in certain regions of Kentucky. Here we give the empirical evidentiary basis for supported employment programs. What does the literature tell us? If we're testing a particular assessment or intervention approach, we're reviewing the literature of what's already been done in this area related to whatever it is we're going to be doing. So the conceptual framework, the actual operation of the project, you've got to have a basis in current literature that supports this whatever these activities you're going to be doing. Are they supported by literature? So the literature related to need is usually in one section, and this is related to your intervention, to your treatment, to your training itself. All the same principles that we mentioned. I love Dr. Gooden's idea of an expandable database, really, of references, citations. Track the authors who are studying in these areas and see what they're doing most recently. We can catch articles now really in real time. And then, of course, there's all kinds of good federal information databases that we can get online, in real time. We can get last week's data on any number of phenomena at a national level and often at a state level. So needs to kind of inform the particular operation of what we're doing. Related to that, from the literature review, do the research questions, the hypotheses, the specific goals and objectives of the project, are they tied directly to the literature review? Do they flow from what we know about best practices in those areas? There's always a thing about training or service delivery objectives or research questions, hypotheses. You're going to spell those out. You want them to operationalize as much as possible. Research questions tend to be non-directional, like what are the effects of this intervention on X, Y, and Z outcome, where the hypothesis is directional and says, we expect that participants in this training will improve on these three dimensions by virtue of completing the training. And so pulling those apart and making sure you're using the terms in the right way for questions and hypotheses becomes important in this design section. In the design section, you're also going to at least allude to the organizational structure. It should indicate how each major project partner will be involved in either designing or implementing the project. Sampling and enrollment, where are you getting your, so the target population is the broader group of people from whom you're drawing your sample, but the sample is your particular study or project. So how many people? How many trainees will you have? How many people will receive services from your program? How many research participants are going to enroll? How are you going to enroll them? What is the recruitment procedure? Do they receive incentives for participating? Are there inclusion? We often see studies talk about inclusion criteria, which is what you need in order to participate. Are there exclusion criteria? Things that if you have these, you can't participate for one reason or another. Then the data collection process, or how the services, laying out every single step of your research plan, of your training. Dr. Gooden, in our LEND program, I'm referring back to that again, here we would talk about the curriculum. Dr. Leslie, in evaluation work that you do here, you'd talk about the way you go about collecting the data, how your team is going to go out there and work with these state and national players on the project to make sure that whatever it is, whatever our part of the project is, we can execute it in that way. This is the project design is really like the method section of an article. I would say maybe method and results, right? Because we're also going to get into the measures and instrumentation. How are you going to go about measuring the impact? What tools are you going to use? Whether that's customer satisfaction for people who have participated, whether it's existing data like Social Security records or national core indicators data or whatever it might be, or is it going to be about activity data, like how many of certain things did you deliver, how many trainings did you do, et cetera. The data analysis section here, if you're going to be using statistical analyses, you want to talk about them here. Reviewers will check to make sure that your analyses are compatible with the questions and hypotheses. Even if it's not a statistically oriented project, they want to see how you're going to measure the outcomes, how many people are going to benefit in which ways, how will you know when an objective has been reached. Quite often in the project design, you see a section of involvement of certain partners, including people with lived experience with disability. This is increasingly the case in grants and in the inclusion area. They want to see how will people with disabilities be involved in all aspects of the project. Sometimes if the project is working with other populations, it will say, how are you including Native Americans in this process? How are you including young people with disabilities and their families, et cetera. So that becomes really important as well. And it's really a prelude to the discussion of staff and resources in many ways. But sometimes right in the design, it's how are people going to be involved, various people be involved in those designs, and are there particular populations that the government or the agency is requiring to be involved in various ways. So specificity matters here, a very thorough literature review with objectives or research operations that flow directly from that, and then you spell those out in really exquisite detail. That's how you get all the points on this section. This section can be as much as half of all the points in a proposal. So it's very important. Usually about half the space in the narrative is devoted to this as well. So this becomes really, really important. And generally speaking, if the reviewer likes your design, they start to like the other aspects as well. So they sort of, it's like what Dr. Leslie was saying, if you feel they've got you, if you catch them on the abstract, they're going to keep reading. If you've got a good design, they're going to interpret your other sections sort of through that lens. So the design is like worth 50 points. Sometimes it's worth really even more than that though, because it carries forward throughout the rest of the proposal. Dr. Gooden, Dr. Leslie, anything to add on the design sections? You've written designs in some types of projects I haven't, and anything you'd like